And I want to read to you a quote before we read the text, and I think it somewhat could fit to this. I tried to find who wrote this. I apologize if it's somebody I wouldn't agree with, but I couldn't find the source of it, at least with any certainty. The quote was this: "Never regret a day in your life. Good days give happiness, bad days give experiences, worst days give lessons, and best days give memories." And I thought, well, if I could take a little bit of liberty with that quote, and if I could just take that and put a Christian perspective on our experiences on difficult days, it would be something like this: an understanding God's loving care, sovereign hand, and divine purposes in our lives, we should never regret difficult days. They are God-ordained experiences which impact our lives with deep and meaningful lessons which are not easily forgotten and are designed by God in such a way that we might find greater joy in Jesus Christ. And really, there's a lot there. I worked through that carefully, even this idea that they bring deep and meaningful lessons which are not easily forgotten. Earlier, he wrote, or she wrote in that quote, "The best days give memories." Isn't it true, though, that difficult days give long-term memory? I think of some of the experiences that we had while serving in Cameroon that were challenging, and it's those difficult times where I can virtually bring back to mind pictures and moments like I was living through the experience again. And it was difficult. The difficulty of it really just cements it in. But then how God mixes with that lessons so that the unforgettable experience is tied in with some way in which He is shaping and forming us. And it has this way of working in us to find greater and greater joy in Jesus Christ. Have you noticed that? Now think about that as we read the text. And if you look down at your Bibles, maybe your Bible's like mine, and it has some headings at the top. If you were to look back to chapter 13, the heading on mine is "The Israelites Go Out of Egypt." That's our setting. At the end of that chapter, the end of chapter 13, they are led away, and then we have where Pharaoh pursues them and the Egyptians are drowned. And then we have in chapter 15, we have this song of Moses. And so this is really just coming out of an incredible experience. I mean, there's that in itself is unmatched. In fact, it's looked back on in other places of Scripture. Uh, God Himself turns His people back to that very moment that just took place. And then we have this at the end of chapter 15. Look at verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, now just think of this, okay? They're going into a wilderness for 3 days. Have you hiked through the desert before? I have. I remember I went on an overnight excursion into the Superstition Mountains, which themselves are a bit dangerous, just on the edge of Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix is the Valley of the Sun. Superstition Mountains, there are people that have gone into those mountains looking for gold, a lost Dutchman's mine, and were killed. They died out there or never came back. I went out there with a buddy of mine, and this was in my younger days, and this is Arizona heat. And we went out there overnight with nothing but, I think, like a jug of water, maybe a pocket knife, and a notebook to record our experiences. And we got to one point going up this unmarked valley, going totally off trail. And it was just more, not like a valley, it was more like a canyon, and just little sparse pockets of barely any water. And the water that was there was not drinkable. And he split off from me, and we went our separate ways for the rest of the time. He took off straight up a mountain, and I went up the canyon. I came to the end of the canyon, and it veered off to one direction. I can remember this. And down below, there's these big, I mean, big rocks, and this little bit of water that was caught from the last rain, and just murky green water down here. But up over on this side, there was a little bit of a flat area, and I went up there to set up my camp. And I remember sitting there and looking back over the canyon, looking at the side of that mountain as it went up, and seeing a little tiny speck of a shadow scaling up that mountain. That was my friend. And we agreed that the next day we would meet together, and so I could go into all my different experiences and so forth. But needless to say, the next day we met, and because his water jug had broken, we had to leave. We had no water. And I don't know if it broke the night before. He didn't have any water since then. But out in the desert, if you don't have water, you can die. I can tell you another story of taking my family on this desert hike. They might call it the death hike. I was used to Arizona. They weren't. And it wasn't the great experience I was hoping it would be. But you need to have water out in the desert. 3 days. Now, imagine you're coming to the end, the third day is gone, and you look at an area, and you can tell there's greenery there, and you can see some pools of water. What is building up in your heart, right? Incredible anticipation of finally satisfying a terrible thirst. And if you're a tough person, your concern for your children or for your spouse or for your parents that are with you that are really getting very weak and dehydrated. And finally, we're going to get some relief. Then it says this, verse 23. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Now, what do you call that? That is an incredible disappointment, right? Now you got to put yourself in this situation. You may not have this exact circumstance, but do you know what it's like to be going through some difficulty and have this anticipation? You see it coming, there's going to be relief, and you get to it, and it doesn't. It's a disappointment. Your hope is shattered. You just got to kind of put yourself in the situation figuratively, principially. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah, and the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. That is, God proved them. And said, "If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee." So he's connecting it up with some key principle, right? Have any of you ever heard of the book, None of These Diseases? Okay. It was actually given to me to read by a friend of mine that was basically diagnosed with terminal cancer, and just considering some of the applications found within that book about diseases and why we have diseases. It was interesting. But he goes on to say, and they came to Elim, where were 12 wells of water, and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters. Now, I want us to look at 4 key principles from the text on how to respond or manage life when God's leading disappoints. Now, that might be too unspiritual of a title for you, but let's understand this is no reflection on God, right? A parent might disappoint their child because of a failure in the parent. I'm sure I have done that. I'm sure I've disappointed my children. I'm sure I've disappointed my wife because of a failure in me. This is no reflection at all on God. God is not doing anything, in a sense, that is wrong. God is doing perfectly what's in his wisdom and goodness and kindness and love for his own children. But we have things that we hope for, right? I mean, what do you hope for? I could share things from our lives and things that we hope for that in the end they just didn't come, and it's a disappointment. And you can really question, what's going on? Is there any question that God was leading them? Did they get to Mara by accident or because of some sin on their part? No, I mean, not at all. There was nothing in them that brought them to a place that incredibly disappointed them. And it's the same with us. It can be very much the same. Let me ask you a question. Is it unreasonable on their part to anticipate that this was the provision of water for them? Was that unreasonable? No. No. Should they have had a hope when they saw the greenery and they saw the water that here it finally would have been? And how many of them do you think praised God before they ever got to the water, anticipating that it was a provision? Probably the spiritual ones, at least. They were recognizing the hand of God, right? They get there, they can't drink it. So let's go through a few different things here to help us with this. When God's leading disappoints. First is this: embrace the believer's reality. Now, why is it that the waters were bitter? And I'm going to extrapolate that out a long ways. Why were the waters bitter? Were they bitter before the fall? Before sin came into the world, were those waters bitter? Yeah, I don't think so. Right? I mean, if there was a purpose in the divine order of the creation of a perfect world to have bitter waters, yeah, maybe. But most likely not. Most likely dealing with the massive alteration that occurred not only through sin, but then through the flood. And here you have an area of just chemicals that have been exposed, natural chemicals been exposed, got into this water and made it to where it was undrinkable. All right. Well, there are things that we go through that really we need to understand. They're just part of our experience as believers, just like the person down the street that's not a believer. And there are things in our lives as believers that are even worse for us than for believers. Or I should say worse. How about this? Can be more difficult, more challenging for us than for believers. Let's consider a few of those. The first one would be this: trouble from without. John 16:33, Jesus says, in the world you shall have tribulation. Acts 14:22 was told to the believers, we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. We go on. Other passages, very clear. We bring in illustrations from the New Testament about this. But also you have temptations from within. Every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. You have the whole matter, Romans 6:11 through 13, of our constant battle with sin. And it doesn't need to be that anybody's there trying to tempt us. It's what's inside of us, right? So you have trouble from without, you have temptations from within, and the whole matter of the battle of dealing with that, and you can have testing from above. Psalm 11, 4 and 5, the Lord is in his temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyelids, behold, his eyelids try the children of men. The Lord trieth the righteous. Psalm 17:3, the finding pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord trieth the hearts. And looking back at the entirety of the wanderings through the wilderness, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 8 these words, and thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee. He led them this way, these 40 years in the wilderness. He led them this way in the wilderness these 40 years. Now we know the reason why was their own hard-heartedness in going into the promised land, but I think it would include, I think we can go back a little bit farther before that incident, even to right here, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or not. In fact, that's exactly in the lesson in this text, very similar to what's in Deuteronomy 8. So God himself is actually engaging in testing our faith, in testing our character, in testing our commitment. He's reproving us like you would do with a metal where you burn off the dross. And then add to that the difficulties of this physical body, its weaknesses, its illnesses, natural disaster, accidents. Are believers exempt from physical illness? My grandma was a godly woman. She suffered and died from Alzheimer's. Before that, she was as sharp as a tack. My wife would say, Grandma, you're going to live longer than we are. We would get to go visit grandma, and this wasn't like, she wasn't like in her 60s. She was, probably in her 80s, around 80s. And she could just, just, we go to the mall, it's grandma going, it's got to catch up with grandma, you know. She actually said that she was like on her second treadmill, she wore out her first one. And but not exempt from the difficulties that come. Natural disasters, accidents. Just think of the flooding that just took place. Did that just hit unbelievers? All these things are in addition to some things that are actually specifically even more difficult for believers. And in this case, God was testing them, right? He led them to that place. He knew exactly what would be in their heart. It was fully reasonable for it to be there. He knew what he was doing when he brought them there. He was bringing that discontentment to the surface. He was putting himself as their Lord. He was trying to bring that into them. Even though they already went through all these other experiences and all the miracles in Egypt and all these other things, sometimes you think, well, have I finally gotten there? Right? We have not finally gotten there. Okay, think what they went through until that point, the incredible nature of what took place in Egypt, their deliverance from Egypt, what took place at the Red Sea, and now this. It's going to continue. And it's going to continue even after they go to the promised land. There's going to be different trials and testings upon them. So this is just to say that we need to have a certain perspective regarding what we hope for or our anticipation. What do you think could distort this to an incredible degree? We actually have a name for it within Christianity. It's a certain perspective on the Christian life. Do you know what I'm talking about? That everything's going to be so good. What do we call that? We call that the prosperity gospel, right? And everything that comes in a package, it's not just the gospel, it goes right into their whole mode of teaching about sanctification and all these things. It sets people up for failure, right? And these scriptures, if you look at, I believe it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, these scriptures are here for us to glean from them and to understand. We should understand, listen, even after all these great victories, God still has work to do in us. It has everything to do with our relationship with Him, Him having the right position in our hearts and lives. This is going to continue, right? Next point. So, secondly, first is to embrace the believer's reality. The second is to guard your attitude. The people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Do you know what murmuring is? I confessed to some of that just the other day on Sunday when we were together. I know I came back and something had happened out here on the front of the church property, and I mentioned what had happened to you. And I know when I went back, what was happening in my heart was I was murmuring. And you know what? God got me on that one. That was a great test. It showed me what was in my heart. Am I willing to allow God to govern what I do and to then use that for by his grace for his glory and reaching people? Am I willing to do that? Well, here in this case, we're here in chapter 15. Just look over in chapter 16. Okay, it's going to be right after this. Here you're going to find this over and over again, but it's instructive about murmuring. And I'm going to relate it back to my illustration. Exodus 16:2, the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Verse 7, and in the morning, when then ye shall see the glory of the Lord, for he heareth your murmurings. And what does it say then? Against who? Now, wait a minute. We just read the text together up in verse 2, right? Who does it say they murmured against? Who does it say they murmured against up in verse 2? Moses and Aaron, right? But down in verse 7, who does it say that they murmured against? Against the Lord. So which one was it? Okay, let's go down further. And it says this, for he heareth your murmurings against the Lord, and what are we that you murmur against us? Moses said, this shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord heareth your murmurings that ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against who? Us, but against who? The Lord. Okay, so let me take this right into my illustration of what took place on Saturday afternoon at approximately 1 o'clock. Okay. When I went back and I murmured about that experience, which really was murmuring against the person who did that, right? Who am I murmuring against? I'm murmuring against the very one that has orchestrated this event. Later on in the event, I recognize God's hand. Later on in the event, I recognize his sovereign hand in doing all those things. Later on, I come to understand even the human instrument in that really did not want to do that and felt bad about it, right? When I murmured against that, I murmured against God. Yes, I murmured against the person, but I murmured against God. Yeah. Well, yeah, his creator. Yeah. Well, and just against, I look at it this way, against the very God that orchestrated all those events in my situation. I didn't really, I I struggled with what was going on and what I wanted to do, right? So, what does the Bible say? Another New Testament passage, Philippians 2. Do all things without, you know the passage, don't you? Do all things without what and disputings, murmurings and disputings. Why is that? That ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God. In other words, reflecting that you are God's children, without rebuke, no necessity of correction, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, the very place that would cause, the very situation that would cause the murmurings. among whom, without murmurings, this is what's going to happen, ye shine as lights in the world. Why is that? Because without murmurings and disputings, as you do this, you really are glorifying God, holding forth the word of life. The word murmuring has the idea of muttering in a low tone. And that's either to someone else or to your own soul. So guard your attitude. Now, listen to this. This passage we know well, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. For Proverbs 4:23. You know what's interesting about that? Really, that can be taken two different ways. One is the part of being careful for passively permitting anything to come into your heart that affects it. Keep or protect your heart with all diligence, that is, from any sort of bad influence, because out of your heart are the issues of life. So you need to protect it from bad influence. You know, there's another way to consider the verse. Now, it could be that both of these are actually intended, but I just want to give you the second, whether it's intended or not, it pulls in an interesting point on this. It is this, that you need to keep your heart. You need to protect it, or you could put it this way, restrain it, because out of it come all the issues of life. Think of what Christ said, what comes out of the heart and defiles the man. So restrain that monster, right? So guard your attitude. Thirdly, consider God's purpose. Consider God's purpose. In the text, he speaks of it this way. He cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. That's God's grace. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. So he's going to do a few things. One of them is going to be testing. One of them is going to be teaching them. He gives this principle in verse 26 of what he will do if they will obey. So here it is. Very simply, God is teaching us. Consider God's purposes. God is teaching us. In that same text in Deuteronomy where it talks about the entirety of the 40-year wanderings, listen to what it says and what God's teaching. And he humbleth thee and suffered thee, or allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know. That he might make you know something. He's teaching us, right? That he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. We would probably do well if we could write down the things God is teaching us through disappointing circumstances. Say, my hope was this. This is how God's working. This is what God is teaching me. We would do well to even write it down. What is God teaching me? To purposely go to the word and try to find, what is God teaching me in this? You know, in James 1, same context of trials of faith, you know, if any man lacks wisdom, let him do what? Let him ask of God. Ask wisdom for what? Not just to what to do, but maybe wisdom in how to understand what God's doing in my life, right? What's God's point? What's his teaching to me? And so there's something that he's teaching us. Then God is working in us. I'm really taking this a little bit differently from the teaching. It is to actually change and mold and form us. You think about these texts, Romans 5:3 and following, not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience. And patience experience, and experience hope. And hope does not make ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which he has given to us. Now, lots of times what we think about is that trials work patience, but there's a lot more than that. Patience is the necessary building block on which we can experience what God's doing. Let's take it back to the illustration or to the actual historical event. Had they had patience, not to murmur, not to be downcast, not to lose hope, had they had patience and did not murmur, but confidently looked to God, what would have happened? God would have allowed them to die of dehydration in the wilderness? Do you think that's what it was? No. They knew God called them there. They knew God led them there, right? That if they had not murmured, if they had been patient, they would have been built up in experience. That's what the text says in Romans 5. That experience would have built hope or a confident expectation of what God will do when you wait on him. Now, they did learn those lessons kind of the back doorway through difficulty, right? They did learn those lessons, but they learned it through the idea of the fact of, they were rebuked and reproved. And they didn't even learn this lesson because you're going to find this word murmur used some 12 times in Exodus and in Numbers about these people. They just kept murmuring. You find the same thing in James 1. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing that the trying of your faith works patience. Why patience? Patience is foundational during the testing of your faith so that the testing of the faith can accomplish its purpose. If you don't have patience, if you cast off everything, if you murmur and complain, and if you're in despair, then you're breaking up the process of what God is doing through that testing of your faith. So testing of your faith works patience. That's the foundational element underneath that allows the testing of our faith to accomplish its purpose. What's its purpose? Let patience have a perfect work, that is through this trial of the faith, that you may be perfect or mature and entire, lacking nothing. You know this one in Romans 8, right? But let me just piece two parts of it together. We know that all things work together for good. Now, we sometimes quote that, and rightfully so, as trying to find some good that, well, God's going to do this and this. God's going to show us a tree that we can throw in that water. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be for good to see how God does some good thing in this. And maybe so. But in the context, what is the good that God's doing in the context of Romans 8? For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's the good. All things work together for good. In the context, the direct context, the good that's highlighted there, I'm not saying that he doesn't do good things in multiple different ways. He's not, single dimensional. God is capable of doing incredible things beyond what we can even understand, and even beyond what we even can perceive in the moment or ever perceive how something happened. But the thing that he's doing is in us. He's conforming us to the image of his Son. Same thing like what it said back in James 1. So God is teaching us. Secondly, God is working in us. And thirdly, God is presently using us. In other words, in the situation of disappointment, okay, if we have this patience, we have this confidence and this trust, God is going to use us. Don't know how? I can give us an example. For we which live are always delivered unto death for Jesus' sake, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our mortal flesh. So then death worketh in us, but life in you. That really isn't the pathway that you're thinking when you go out to be a missionary. That by death working in us, life will be working in other people. You don't really think on those terms. You're on the top of the mountain. You're in the mountain peak experience and this incredible venture that God has called you to, and just incredible anticipation of what God's going to do in and through you for the sake of the gospel. And when Paul, the experienced missionary, writes about it, he says it's death working in us, but life in you. So God is presently even using this paradox. And then God will work through us. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about something in the future. You know, some of you have been saved for decades. You have a certain weight of experience in how God has worked in your life, how he has comforted you through even times of disappointment. And that, what will happen is when God's going to bring somebody into your life that had a similar situation or whatever, and you're going to find that there's this divine appointment with that other believer, and you share something and it's just right on the money. That happened just recently. Witnessed something like that. No predetermined connection designed for that to happen, but it happened. And as an observer from the outside, it was the hand of God using somebody who had gone through difficulty, ministering to somebody going through difficulty. It's amazing. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 6 speaks of this. And it says this, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. So the past experience of how God worked in us, we can then minister to others. So God will work through us. And then fourthly and lastly is to look for God's grace. The grace is seen in two ways. One is in the tree that they cast into the water. And the second is next time they come to 12 wells of water. And it's just a delight. So there's grace in the disappointment, and there's grace for deliverance from the disappointment. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into that, but you know, sometimes we just want the escape from it. And there's grace in the midst of it. What is the grace of God for the disciples when they're in the boat and the waves are coming in and the boat's about to sink and the Lord Jesus is asleep up in the boat? What's the grace to bring them help and comfort in the midst of a life-threatening situation? It's just the very fact, though he's asleep, he's right there. He's right there. Right? Would you, I mean, no one wants to go down in a sinking ship, but if you're going to go down a sinking ship, what if the Lord Jesus is right there? And as it's beginning to sink, he's right there. And you know, for us in our experiences, sometimes nothing's taken away, but the Spirit of God ministers his presence, the Lord's presence to our soul. And it is enough. It is enough. Can you please, I think they're coming. Can you please have them hold on that? Sorry about that. I don't know if my time's off up here. My time still says I have a couple more minutes. Sorry about that. We just have a little bit more and we'll finish up here. Grace for deliverance from the disappointment. And this is that text, there hath therefore no, there hath no temptation or testing taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you or suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. The word there, testing, is the idea. And God makes a way of escape. Back to the boat. I've always thought of it this way. You know what? The water would have eventually woken the Lord. Right? But even if not, how should they have come to the Lord and expressed their concern regarding the ship sinking? They go and they just cry out, Master, Master, we perish. But there would have been a way to go in confidence and for God to give deliverance. Now, if you look at your sheet, there's some personal applications. What false expectations did you have which are causing your soul trouble in your present situation? Secondly, what are you murmuring about or tempted to murmur about? Thirdly, how can you see God working out his purposes through this disappointment? And then fourthly, How can you exercise faith in God for his grace? Trust that this is an encouragement to you. It's definitely something that we are all either have gone through, going through, or will go through. And just trust that God will encourage us through it. Father, thank you for your grace.